Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the next in a series of NASEO calls. This is our financing committee call for the quarter. Good to have you all on the line. This is Sam Kramer, the financing program director at NASEO. I'm really excited to have you here. We've got a really good lineup of speakers ready to talk to you about thinking about financing and funding programs in the context of COVID-19. I'm going to turn this over to our co-chairs for the financing committee, Dan Farrell of Virginia DMME and Jeff Pitkin of NYSERDA, to help kick us off and get things going. Jeff and Dan, are you there?
Sam, I'm here. This is Dan. Sam, can you hear me?
Yep, you're coming through loud and clear.
Okay, great. All right, well, thanks for the introduction and welcome everybody. Dan Farrell with the State Energy Office in Virginia, Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy. Just wanted to welcome you all today. Thank you for tuning in. Housekeeping, the agenda and materials for this call are available through the NASEO Financing Committee page. And I think Sam can send the URL out to everybody for that, so you have access to that. So if you click on the link, it's under the financing events sidebar to the right. So today's agenda, we're going to be focusing on better understanding how to react to and plan for the economic downturn caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. As you all know, state and local governments, businesses, households are struggling in the current economy. And so what we were going to do today is sort of reflect back on the last recession for a number of reasons, because many of us were at state energy offices during the last recession and some of us were not. So we think there's a benefit in sort of reflecting back how state energy offices and clean energy played a role in pulling us out of the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. And how that may be helpful to see how we might approach navigating this economic scenario that we're in due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to introduce our speakers for today.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Jeff Pitkin. Our speakers, as Dan said, are going to do a little bit of reflection back on the 2008 recession and offer some thoughts on activities that state energy offices did then and could consider doing now, and maybe also providing some thoughts on how the prior recession may differ from our current situation. So we're going to hear from each speaker for about 15 to 20 minutes. Then we'll open up the line for any questions. If you have any questions, please enter them into the chat function on the sidebar. And we can ask them once all speakers have finished. So our speakers today are first Mark Sylvia, who's Chief of Staff with Blue Wave Solar. Mark was previously at the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources as a commissioner beginning in 2010 during their implementation and oversight of the ERA funding. And he was Director of Green Communities in 2009 when they developed the programs and processes to distribute ERA funds to the cities and towns. And then secondly we have Bruce Schlein, Director of Efficiency as a Service Finance for Citi. Bruce is a seasoned veteran, seasoned warrior who has been working with a number of us over the years and has some very strong experience and perspectives that he can share on state and local energy programs and offer that from a larger bank perspective. So I'm now going to turn it over to Mark to start the presentation. So Mark, take it away whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to show my screen and I'll start from the beginning here. Thank you all very much. It's a great honor for me to be with you all today. I'm a proud alum of NASEO and the NASEO Board of Directors, and really appreciate all of the work that the state energy officials do every day to try and address our most pressing energy needs all across the United States. And I'm pleased to be here to talk a little bit about the experience we had in Massachusetts with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. We learned a lot from that whole process, a lot of which I think is very instructive or will be very instructive as hopefully Congress sets its sight on the next stimulus initiative to help us deal post-COVID with economic recovery. So what I wanted to cover in my presentation to all of you today is first trying to set the context, how we were able to rapidly deploy millions of dollars in ARA funds in Massachusetts. Really started with the structure that we put in place. After that, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we structured the ARA funding. I mean, a lot of it was directed by the federal government, but we were able to deploy funds pretty rapidly and successfully because of the process that we put in place and the response from the different recipients. And then finally, just end with some really high-level thoughts on what could be helpful for energy stimulus efforts in 2020 and beyond. So just to give you a sense of the structure that we had, it really began in 2006 when Governor Deval Patrick at the time was sworn in. Among his priorities were education and healthcare, as well as life sciences, but clean energy and climate were a real big priority for him, and addressing energy costs. And on energy in particular, the governor real quickly set his sights on building the programs, policies, and infrastructure to make Massachusetts a national leader. And that's everything from rejoining the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative to taking the energy and environmental executive offices and combining them into one secretariat to really focus on meaningful ways to address both energy and climate issues. And he was very active with our legislature in signing landmark legislation that really set a structure in place that helped us to deploy ARA funds, and equally, if not more importantly, enabled us to build programs and efforts and momentum that created a very robust clean energy economy in Massachusetts. So in particular, there are three pieces of legislation that were passed. And the reason why I'm mentioning this in the context of ARA is because those three pieces of legislation created the administrative infrastructure, the program infrastructure, and the priority to help us to develop programs and deploy those funds to help residents, businesses, and cities and towns. The first is the Green Communities Act. And among the things that the Green Communities Act did was prioritize energy efficiency, expanded the RPS, and created the first in the nation Green Communities program. And I'll come back to that in the context of ARA. The Global Warming Solutions Act, which set really robust and stringent goals for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And really the Green Communities Act was the implementation efforts for the Global Warming Solutions Act. And then there was the Green Jobs Act, which created the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, which still is a quasi-public economic development agency focused on clean energy and helping to incubate new businesses and create clean energy jobs. So that is kind of the precursor to what happened with the Great Recession, or actually during the Great Recession in 2008, those three pieces of legislation were signed by Governor Patrick. But around that same time, we're all very familiar with the Great Recession and the federal government's response. The Bush administration had signed the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act, which was focused primarily on providing funding to TARP. And then when President Barack Obama was sworn in, he signed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009 with a focus on providing significant investments across the United States, targeted spending and tax cuts in a number of different areas, 787 billion, of which there was a significant investment in energy programs and projects throughout the United States. 27 billion was focused on energy efficiency and renewable energy programs. And then there was an additional 25 billion between energy infrastructure and home energy credit for homeowners. So when in preparing for ARA and the influx of dollars that were coming to Massachusetts, the state did a full assessment identifying across each area of our state government identified shovel-ready projects, things that we could deploy dollars as quickly as possible to really maximize the stimulus funding and get people back to work. The governor set very clear goals, and that was goals on investing in the long term. The recovery goals were in line with that. I show that in this slide. So the purpose of ARA was to stimulate the economy, invest for the long term, and deliver meaningful government accountability, all of which I am certain is a priority in what Congress is working on now for a second round of stimulus in the COVID-19 environment. But for Massachusetts, the governor's priorities included focusing on education, clean energy, safety, statewide transportation network, and investing in Massachusetts' innovation economy. So all of that was directive for us in how we were going to then build the programs and the implementation mechanisms to get meaningful dollars out the door. So to give you a sense of on the energy side and the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources, which is our state energy office, the programs that we were responsible for administering under ARA or in partnership with other sister agencies were the state energy program, which I know you are all very, very much familiar with, and that was the mechanism through which investments directly to states went, $54.9 million. The weatherization assistance program, which we provided support to our Housing and Economic Development Agency on. The Energy Efficiency Conservation Block Grants, which our Green Communities Division was most appropriately positioned, having built relationships with cities and towns. And then the Energy Efficiency Appliance Rebate Program. To give you a particular snapshot, here are the priorities that Massachusetts had for our state energy program funds. Of that 54 million, 21 million went to high performance buildings, which included direct grants, as well as a $4 million energy efficiency loan fund, which was a loan loss reserve to expand energy efficiency efforts in our 3-year utility driven efficiency plans. Leading by example, 15 million went to state facilities to upgrade state facilities from an efficiency and renewables perspective. There were dollars that were also earmarked, 18 million to solar stimulus to support what was then our Commonwealth solar program. So going back to how we were able to effectively implement the dollars and programs that ARA provided, the Green Communities Act, as I mentioned, created the Green Communities Division, which was a division focused on helping all 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts meet their clean energy goals. It was an agency that cities and towns weren't afraid of because we weren't an enforcement agency and we truly were the government and we were there to help. And so the EECBG, the Energy Efficiency Conservation Block Grant programs, made sense to be administered through Green Communities. We got those dollars, both direct and indirect grants, out the door to large municipalities, helping to provide support, and for smaller municipalities to actually design programs along with them. The state energy program dollars that went to Leading by Example, we provided support to state agencies, and then qualified energy conservation bonds. We provided the support to businesses and municipalities that chose to take advantage of QECBs. The Energy Efficiency Division, which was also created under the Green Communities Act, also provided support by directly administering the Energy Efficient Appliance Rebate Program and worked with the Housing and Economic Development Agency on the Weatherization Assistance Program. And then Green Jobs, I mentioned the Clean Energy Center. There was a $24 million Wind Test Blade Center grant that went to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and Mass CEC oversaw the construction and manages to this day that project. Having that mechanism in place enabled us to tap into those dollars and then deploy. And this, I won't go into any detail, but this just goes to show you the Green Communities Division and their support in providing all of the options that were available to cities and towns letting them know all of the funding opportunities that were available to them and providing support. And I can say, because I was in the trenches at the time, that we were able to effectively get all of those dollars out the door, work with cities and towns, and provided them with support through technical assistance grants so that they could meet their compliance requirements. And it ultimately created additional job opportunities for renewable energy companies, energy efficiency companies that did the work, as well as performance contracting companies, ESCOs. This just gives you a sense of the programs that I talked about before on the state energy program. Really important to emphasize things like the loan fund for EE measures that enabled us to expand our approach to reaching more small businesses and households and doing more deep energy retrofits. So kind of looking at what we did and the success with which we were able to do it, a lot of it had to do with developing the infrastructure in advance, which none of us anticipated those dollars coming to Massachusetts. But regardless of whether or not there was a stimulus bill, providing structure to help cities and towns, small businesses, homes through our energy efficiency division and our green communities division really helped us to identify shovel-ready projects and to actually deploy those dollars in the most effective way. I also think that, similarly with COVID-19 and any stimulus dollars, having the right structure in place to deliver those dollars is going to be critically important, because you want to get those dollars out into the economy as soon as possible. Encouragement of quasi-public entities in partnership with economic development agencies. The Clean Energy Center is a really good example of an entity that has some flexibility that government agencies don't necessarily have. And they were able to more directly tap into new companies and job training programs that the government itself wasn't able to. I can't emphasize enough the importance of shovel readiness. That was deliberate on our part to make sure that we could get projects done in time and in a transparent and accountable way. Transparency and accountability are critical. On the programming side, as we look towards what may come out of Congress, direct energy efficiency and renewable grants to municipal entities, whether it's for the municipalities themselves or to administer in partnership with small businesses in their communities, was a formula for success for us, and communities were eager to step in and support it. State energy grants for modernizing state facilities. Leading by example is critically important, and being able to save the taxpayer dollars, whether it's at the local or state level, is critically important. And at the same time, modernizing state facilities and meeting clean energy and climate goals was something that we were able to achieve. Providing funding and tax credits for businesses, that's always something that I think some people debate whether grants are better than tax credits or loans. We found that having the diversity of support, whether it's loans, tax credits, or grants, you'll be able to reach different segments of the economy, and especially with loans, leverage additional dollars to get projects built. So the last slide that I have is all of this is to say, whether it was building the infrastructure or then being able to deploy ARA funds and direct them to either established programs or effectively through agencies that were charged or departments that were charged with that, we've got a really good story to tell in Massachusetts. These are a couple slides from our annual clean energy report that is issued by the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. And where we were in 2008 in terms of the clean energy economy and where we are today are like night and day. And a lot of that had to do with, again, having the right infrastructure in place, but even putting those stimulus dollars to work really helped jumpstart an economy that continues to be sustainable today. And with that, I will end my presentation.
Great. Great, thanks, Mark. And now we'll turn things over to Bruce Schlein from Citi. Bruce, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I'm going to make you the presenter.
Okay. Great. Okay, just 1 second here. Okay, great. So thank you, Sam, for inviting me, Jeff, for the nice introduction, and Mark, good to be joining you. So there are 4 topics that I'm going to touch on. And actually, I'm not going to turn to my screen until the last topic, so you can ignore the screen for the moment. But what I thought I would do is just try to touch on a few different trends, programs that we're involved with that I think are, particularly relevant for the current environment. And those 4 are, the first is the kind of rise of impact investing, and recent announcements of commitments from a number of organizations, some of that driven by the economic downturn, some of that driven by the movements around racial injustice. So I'm going to spend a few minutes on that. The second is just to talk a little bit about CPACE and how that's intersecting with us, and why that might be particularly helpful in the current environment. A few minutes on alternative underwriting, particularly on the single family side of things, which I think is a bit of a double-edged sword in this environment. And by that I mean, there may be increased reservations around pursuing alternative underwriting, but there may also be all the more reason to pursue alternative underwriting as economic pressures put downward pressure on the ability for some who are negatively impacted by traditional underwriting. And then the last area that I wanted to touch on was efficiency as a service. So I'll just spend a couple of minutes on each of those, and then we'll look forward to discussion. So impact investing, I just saw, I think a few days ago, that Amazon announced, I believe, a couple $2 billion initiative or commitment to the climate space. We at Citi launched an impact investing program this year, our own balance sheet, in a few different verticals, including sustainability and prioritizing minority and women-owned businesses. And so I think from a state energy office perspective, to the extent that you're able to, kind of build awareness amongst the businesses in your community that these programs exist, that they're a source of, capital for efficiency, renewables, and other programs, could be a helpful resource. And for sure, I should be included in that. We are on the hunt for companies working in this space, again, particularly minority and women founded companies, but not exclusive. And I would say, in the context of the current environment, from our perspective, and I think from many other companies' perspectives, we're not at all pulling back. We're doing the opposite. An impact fund is all the more important in a moment like this. And so we're pushing hard to deploy those resources. So that's the impact investing side. The second topic, commercial PACE. I know this is a topic Jeff and Sam and many of you are all very familiar with. What I would just note about that from my seat, from where I sit, and this I think is, work to be done on the bank side, and to the extent that state energy offices might facilitate or help or implore banks to put some thought around this topic, is really in part around the issue of mortgage holder consent, right? So I think may be aware that in PACE programs, commercial PACE programs, typically mortgage holder consent is required. And I would say, speaking openly about us at Citi, we are in need of having a standard understanding across everybody that touches commercial mortgages in the bank of what PACE is. We need a standard approach to responding to requests for mortgage holder consent. And maybe more importantly, not just for us, but for the banking community as a whole, if you are a policymaker and you are launching a PACE program or have a PACE program, and you want a line of sight to what portion of the market could potentially utilize that tool, an important piece of information is understanding what portion of the market could successfully get consent from their mortgage holder, assuming they have a mortgage to begin with, of course. And so, one idea that we're working on in the context of New York City, which is preparing to launch the PACE program, is to do that, is to bring together a group of banks to kind of go through what I just described in terms of looking at our existing portfolio, doing a preliminary read on indicative consent information, whether we would provide consent or not, and so that information in the aggregate, I think, could be very useful, again, not just for jurisdictions, but for market actors in terms of who they might target, how they might organize their work. And so anyway, that was my second thought, CPACE. The third one around alternative underwriting. Again, I know this is a topic Jeff is keenly familiar with, and I'm sure many of you are. And that is, are there alternatives to, and this is really on the household side of things, are there alternatives to kind of traditional FICO and the like based underwriting? And this is important, I think, particularly at a time when, given economic conditions, the read of those traditional underwriting approaches may start to change, and to the extent that organizations that are successfully using alternative underwriting, may be really important at a moment like this, or may be able to fill a gap. And again, I recognize it's a bit of a double-edged sword, right? Because utilizing alternative underwriting requires the financial institutions that are supporting those organizations to subscribe to that and buy into that. And so, performance data and history is certainly important. But, I can think of a couple of organizations, Posigen being one of them, Solstice being another that I think are making some good headway on this front and deserve, you know, a look and some support. And then the last topic that I thought I would touch on is efficiency as a service. And I think this is particularly germane at this time as, you know, budgets come under pressure and the availability of debt capacity or other forms of resources to fund improvements on properties, whether they're public properties or not. Efficiency as a service is an alternative that allows for improvements to be made on a third-party ownership basis. And I can appreciate, again, many of you, maybe all of you, are very familiar with this construct, but just for the sake of edifying, or for those of you who might not, I am going to share my screen now, or use my screen, and just juxtapose an energy performance contract with efficiency as a service, because I think there are many instances when I talk with people who conflate the two or confuse the two. And an energy performance contract is actually embedded in the efficiency as a service structure, but they're very different. And the key difference is who owns the assets, and because of that ownership, where the balance sheet treatment lies. So just coming here to my screen, and I will just run through this. There are only 2 slides, so I'll be through this in just a couple of minutes. But what you see here on the screen is a traditional energy performance contract. I'm sure all of you, many of you are familiar with this. You have a contract between, in your cases, maybe a jurisdiction, a school system, and an ESCO to do work. They guarantee that. And then there is a separate agreement with a financial institution that finances it with a loan or a lease. And the key point here is that those 2 relationships are separate. The bank may structure its lease or loan based on the flow of savings, but it is not taking that risk. It is going to require those loan or lease payments regardless of how the ESCO performs. And if there's any performance issue, it is between the host and the ESCO to resolve. In a efficiency services agreement or efficiency as a service, what happens is an intermediary steps into the middle. We call that an ESA provider. And that ESA provider creates a service co. They inject equity into it. A bank puts in debt. And it's that service co that enters into the EPC contract with the ESCO. And then they enter into a separate contract with the host. So under this structure, the host only pays for units of energy saved. If there is any performance issue, that is for service co to resolve with the energy services company. And then lastly, I already pointed this out, because a third party owns and operates the improvements, it sits on their balance sheet, not on the host's balance sheet. And so this structure allows for off-balance sheet accounting, doesn't require any upfront capital. And so I end with this example, again, in the context of current conditions where there may be significant budget pressures and willingness on the part of the ESA providers of the world to step in and provide this type of service. So I'll conclude there. Thank you all again, and look forward to questions and discussion. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Bruce. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the questions panel or raise your hand, and I think we should be able to unmute you. First of all, the slides will be made available after the webinar is over, but we do have a question here in the question box. And this I think is for Mark. So for Mark, states had to manage the federal requirements under ARA, such as Davis-Bacon, NEPA, and Buy American. These requirements did slow down the deployment of funds. What would you recommend for future stimulus in this context?
Thank you very much for that question. And I think that one of the ways that we were able to manage through those requirements was we set up a recovery office that was charged with coordinating with each agency and secretariat that was distributing funds. I think it's important for Congress to not only identify the importance certainly of accountability and of, to the extent possible, Buy America, but we also have to recognize that there needs to be some flexibility. And I think it will be important for organizations like NASEO and others to be part of that conversation as Congress is developing stimulus programs in the next round. So again, for us, we had an office that oversaw all of those efforts and worked directly with each one of the agencies that distributed grant funds. We also provided technical assistance to grant recipients to make sure that they did all of the proper reporting. But I think it's critically important as well to make sure that we find a streamlined process to still meet some of those public policy objectives, but not make it as difficult or as there was a lot of paperwork and a lot of effort. And I think given the circumstances we find ourselves in now, which is even more challenging than the Great Recession, we need to make sure that there's flexibility built in.
Great. What other questions do you have for either of our speakers? Bruce, I have a question. Thinking about your comments on CPACE, there's been a lot more discussion and interest around the use of CPACE for retroactivity. And I was wondering if you could maybe touch on that, if that's been something you guys have been hearing about over at Citi. Is that something you've been kind of looking into or not?
And Sam, just so I make sure I understand the question, applicability to us, or you mean in the market in general, in terms of
just in the market in the market in general?
Yeah. So CPACE provides, I think, at least two benefits that I think are important from our perspective, from the market's perspective. One is it helps us to overcome underwriting challenges with properties that may not have easily accessible credit information, right? So on the institutional side, you have rated entities. On the single family side, you have FICO scores. It's everything in between that it's possible to derive an understanding of their credit, but it takes work. It's not as easy as looking something up, right, in terms of FICO or rating from the likes of a Fitch or S&P or what have you. So PACE, takes that away, right? Because we're not looking, financial institutions are no longer looking at necessarily at the credit of the owner of the property, but they're looking at the ability of a jurisdiction to, collect the tax payments. And so that's really important. And secondly, that it stays with the property, not with the owner, right? And so it helps overcome some of the challenges around property owners opting not to pursue improvements because they don't believe they'll see the full benefit of it. And, there's lots of wrinkles around those two, points that I just made, but, they're really important. And I do think, they hold a lot of promise and a lot of value. I would say among the challenges, and I was, I hope, transparent enough in my remarks, is really just socialization amongst market actors, right? In terms of understanding what PACE is, how it works, what are the implications for, the different parties that have an involvement in a property. But the commercial PACE market is picking up, and there are a number of commercial PACE financiers that are growing and building up a track record, securitizing assets. So I see positive trends, and as I said, where I am in New York City, they are in the process of launching a PACE program, which I think again holds a lot of promise. But I will repeat what I said earlier, which is a lot of socializing to do, a lot of and part of that socializing includes, I think, visibility into who's likely to receive consent, what can be done to facilitate that consent process. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question, Sam.
It does. Thank you. Another question here, and I think this is for both of you. Do you have a sense that there is a greater need to help end-use building owners or borrowers, or providing support to the clean energy service providers, either through cash flow or workforce issues, or what have you, to get through the COVID situation? And this is for either one.
I don't know who wants to go first, Bruce.
I'm happy to, yeah, sir. I'm happy to go first. So I'm not sure I have visibility into like which side of the equation needs help, more help. I will say that in my business, I do finance efficiency as a service, and priorities definitely have shifted recently, given COVID, particularly COVID, and the related economic pressures. Interestingly, I think there's a lot of opportunity to look at the intersection between improvements to buildings for efficiency and improvements to buildings to address COVID and other COVID-like scenarios that may, come down the road. And, with things like air handling equipment, lighting that could have a positive impact on removing or killing certain bacteria and the like. And so, given the immediate imperative to address COVID and make buildings in reality be safe and feel safe, I do think there's an opportunity to, look at those two issues together, and that may require some underlying policy positions or views. For instance, allowing PACE to be used for improvements related to COVID, for example, or some percentage of a PACE obligation to be used for COVID.
Yeah, and I would just say is I think as the question was asked whether funding should be or prioritization should be made towards the building owner or the building versus the service provider, in part based on what Bruce said and the opportunity for there to be that combination of focus on COVID hardening and efficiency and looking at them not separately but together seems to me, and given the challenges that a lot of property owners and small business owners that maybe own their buildings are having, or even in the leasing market right now with a lot of people working remotely, it's an interesting question, and it seems like the resource may be better placed with the buildings, but I think that there are a lot of businesses that are well positioned on the efficiency side to provide those services and to provide unique financing. But I would say that focusing on the building might have the bigger impact.
Great, thanks, Mark. Another question here is that, Mark, you spoke to the importance of a mix of grants and loans to serve different market segments. Given the maturity of the market and the severity of this economic downturn, are there any insights on the appropriate mix of loans or loans to grants states should implement? And also, should federal dollars be appropriated?
If I definitively knew the answer to that, then I should be playing the lottery. But yes, I do think that there's an opportunity for the federal government to play an important role in providing support for, especially in those states and areas where there may not be the necessary infrastructure to address clean energy and climate issues. I think that at least what we found with ARA, that was a prioritization. There was a prioritization on energy and clean energy in particular, and dollars were directed specifically to each of the 50 states. And some of it was very direct and specific to cities and towns. Some of it was for innovation or for job training, and some of it provided flexibility to develop loan programs that might spur more economic activity and address some challenges that otherwise weren't addressed through kind of your standard energy efficiency programming means. And I think that was a success of ARA, and I think that's something that we've learned from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act that we should take and implement in any new stimulus program that's provided. I don't know that there's a perfect formula for grants versus loans, and I think to some extent you need to provide flexibility to states on designing what that mix should be, because some states are either more far along on in investing in energy priorities than others, or some may have more infrastructure than others, or some may have economic development entities that already provide some of that support. So I think you'd want to provide that flexibility, but I think we have a lot of positive to learn from the ARA experience, and I don't think we need to necessarily reinvent the wheel with any new stimulus program that comes out.
Thanks, Mark. Question here for Bruce. On efficiency as a service, why hasn't there been more uptake or activity to date just yet?
That is a great question. So I have theories on it. I'm not sure they hold, but one theory is that, maybe this is less of a theory and based on experience. So I've had a number of instances where, and this is with private sector institutional clients. So the general trend with corporates is they are setting environmental goals, efficiency goals at a pace faster than they are prepared to self-finance those improvements. And typically the self-finance threshold for a corporate is a simple 2-year payback. They'll self-finance anything that meets that threshold, and if it goes out longer than that, it's, you know, get in line with everyone else for, you know, requests for use of capital. And so then what happens is the operations team that has been tasked with those goals looks for alternatives, and they, among the alternatives they find is efficiency as a service. And then they come back to their treasury folks to get their consent or approval to proceed. And usually they come back with, you know, something like a pilot. And so it'll be $1 million or a couple $1 million. And the treasury folks will say, why are we going to this level of complexity and brain damage, you know, for something so small? We'll just self-finance it. And it's a little comical, right? So the operations folks are like, yeah, you know, we were here 6 months ago looking for resources for this and we were declined. The way this all gets undone and why I believe uptake will increase, and I see it increasing, is when in the middle of that conversation, the operations people say, well, what I'm bringing you is a pilot for, you know, 2 or 3 sites, but we've got 100 sites, or we have 1,000 sites that we're going to need to do to meet goals, and you're not going to want to self-finance that. And that's why you want to, you know, consider an approach like this. And I have been in conversations exactly like that, where that outcome that I just described does happen, but it does take some socializing, and it does take some, you know, a certain type of organization with a sophisticated enough operations team and a fulsome conversation between them and Treasury and partners that can execute this to, you know, to get there. So I feel like efficiency as a service is about a decade or so behind PPAs, but rapidly starting to now rapidly catch up.
Great, thank you, Bruce. Question here from Mark. Mark, could you speak to the challenges from a workforce perspective regarding COVID? You know, we obviously need massive stimulus and increase in job activity, but you know, COVID really presents a lot of challenges from a safety standpoint.
Sure. And maybe I can speak specifically to the experience in the solar industry, because that's where I am now. And I will say, on the one hand, and it depends on the state and how they approached construction guidelines in COVID-19. But in Massachusetts, for example, the guidelines that were implemented required some additional steps be taken on a job site for large-scale ground-mounted systems, but it didn't create a burden that would have stopped construction from proceeding. So in terms of construction jobs related to solar projects where we were really concerned, the guidelines that were put in place were manageable and enabled that segment of the industry to continue to proceed. I also believe that the state's rapid response from a policy perspective to expanding or extending application deadlines helped as well, so that projects could continue, even though, despite some of the challenges on equipment delays, et cetera. Where that industry has been harder hit from a workforce perspective has been on the residential installer side and the kind of door-to-door sales for solar. That's where we've seen, and I'm sure it's not only true in Massachusetts and the other New England states, but across the US, that typically required people going into a home or a small business or into an actual building. And so I know that there were a number of solar companies that had to reduce their workforce or had to adjust accordingly. And so that has had an impact. I will also say that the PPP stimulus funding has been really helpful. I'm sure it's been very helpful across different business industries, but certainly I can say in clean energy and renewables, to the extent that companies were able to apply for and get it, that has been helpful. But the question now is, where do we go from here? As Sam and I were talking before this started, that's set to end at a definitive date, and if there's no way to address that moving forward, that could have additional implications. So it will be very interesting to see where we go from here in terms of restrictions, because I think it's those jobs where COVID-19 guidelines, and rightfully so, should be in place that are more restrictive. I think that has very big impacts on the workforce.
Thanks, Mark. And I think we have time for one more question for both you and Bruce. So while we as state energy officials, we don't have all the solutions to the issues that kind of arise when changes occur in the economy or with policy, but we do have the ability to develop plans and programs and inform decision making, and also educate new leaders on the value our offices provide around financing initiatives. So what are maybe one or two takeaways you'd want to share with us before we end the call today? Just kind of thinking about the COVID-19 downturn and what us as energy officers should be thinking about.
If I could, I may just repeat what I said at the outset, which is there is, I think, a significant new pools of resources being made available, being driven by a number of current events. And I think and those organizations need help effectively deploying them, and me included. And they may not always come in the right form. And so, maybe there's discussions to be had around that, but I would just say, an effort to kind of be aware of what's out there, what's new, what's out there, and how to access it is important.
Two things. One of which I think is a valuable lesson or a valuable tool that we used prior to the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and then the other is just, I think, an important message for you not only to relay to your secretary or your governor, and that is the real positive impact and quick results that building a robust clean energy economy or clean energy industry has. I mean, we've got real facts to back that up in Massachusetts, and multiple states now are doing annual clean energy reports. And I know using the term clean energy or green energy sometimes can be a bit of a dividing term. So, it depends on how it resonates in your particular state. But I can tell you that our experience in growing the clean energy economy, both during, and it started during a Great Recession and has been maintained and has expanded each year since, between Democratic and Republican administrations. It is a real tool. Consumers, citizens, residents, if you look at polling data, Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, liberals, are all very much focused on clean energy and climate issues, and it is a real mechanism to move forward in growing your economy and creating meaningful, long-lasting jobs. So I think that's a message that should be sent, and is a reason why it should be part of any stimulus package, because it is I don't even want to say it's an industry of the future, because it's here now, and the United States has amazing potential. The other thing that I will say is that it's important for you now as state energy officials to start to think about, to start to develop what you think are important priorities for any kind of stimulus that may come down the line. Think through and identify shovel-ready projects or shovel-ready programs that you can put dollars to work to right away. Because if you can demonstrate that you have put thought into how you want to distribute funds or utilize any stimulus dollars or find ways to address some of the biggest challenges that we're going to face in this, during and after this COVID pandemic. If you have a plan and priorities in place, it's a lot easier for you to argue for them and for your secretary or governor to support them if you've thought about it beforehand and not, during or after the fact.
Great, thanks, Mark. We are just out of time, so if we can have Dan and Jeff wrap this up, we can close out the webinar and move on with our days.
Hi, Sam. Is that or is that Jeff?
Either or is fine.
Go for it, Dan. Go for it.
All right. Well, Bruce and Mark, thank you both very much for your time and perspective and expertise. Obviously, you go back a long time on this, so we really appreciate the advice and the guidance. And with that, we'll wrap up. And please follow up with Sam if you have any other questions, and we'll go from there. So thanks, everybody, for your time this afternoon.
All right. Thank you very much.
Bye now.